Hello, everybody. So we're going to talk about community ecology. We talked about population ecology, and we also went through the basics of a just ecology in general. So we're going to go over some basic information, Simpson's diversity index, and then what biodiversity is. So our first concept is looking at just community ecology, the very basics of it. So communities and ecosystems change on the basis of interactions among populations and disruptions to the environment. So we know that communities, which are encompassing many different populations or species together, are going to change, obviously, with their interactions between other populations and through the environment. So we know the history of Earth, there's been very significant changes to compositions of communities over time. So, ecological succession is how this occurs. So, this is the process by which an ecosystem changes over time. Often, how this occurs is from a very barren piece of land to a complete ecological community. So, usually, what happens is if we have barren land, there are some plants that we call pioneer plants because they are able to kind of pioneer the way for other things to grow and flourish in these areas. So, pioneer plants are kind of our initial plant species, and then they can slowly grow and evolve over time to create actual ecological communities. So what a community is, it's comprised of different populations in the same geographic area. So yesterday we talked about a population is a specific species. A community is many different populations together. So we know that basically interactions between individuals, they can be intra-specific interactions where they interact with individuals of other populations. Or I'm sorry, within their own population. When they're interspecific, they are with other individuals of other populations. So succession, community composition will change over time, even without disturbances. So the community is going to change over time, even if there's no massive ecological disturbances. So, like a grassland, it will give way to shrubs, and eventually, if conditions are suitable, trees will begin to grow. So, even if there's no massive natural changes going on, we're still going to have composition change over time. A climax community, which we had seen here, that's considered a climax community, refers to the most suitable community for a particular environment. So, a climax community means it has reached its sort of perfect Goldilocks area. It's the perfect environment for where it is. So, not every community is moving towards becoming a forest. There are a lot of regions where a grassland is the climax community. So primary succession, which we saw in this sort of that sort of picture. So that's when there's barren rock, no soil. Pioneer species, these are things like lichen, moss. They can go in and actually break down the rock to form soil. This is how we start to build actual ecological succession. Secondary succession comes after a disturbance that leaves behind the soil. So, if there's abandoned farmland or if wildfires take out a once thriving community, then this can lead to change in a community over time. So, wildfires are detrimental, but they still leave the soil behind. So, we can have secondary succession where we start having plants grow in that barren community that was once thriving. Interaction. So we know what this word means. These are relationships between individuals within a community. They can be either positive or negative. So these impacts can also be direct or indirect. So predator prey interactions, these can be both positive and negative, depend on who is being eaten and who is doing the actual eating. So positive and negative refer to the population number. So if you have a wolf population that is introduced, them coming into a community, they're going to have a negative effect on the elk population because they eat them and make their population go down. But because they're eating the elk, they will have a positive indirect effect on the plant population because now that the elk are being taken out and eaten, the plants are able to thrive more. So, direct, indirect, and positive and negative go hand in hand. It depends on what species you're talking about. So when we talk about direct and indirect effects, this usually leads us to talk about trophic cascades. So this is when one trophic level is reduced or removed from a community completely. So I already talked about wolves of Yellowstone. When they were taken out of Yellowstone, that entire trophic level, which is our top predator, was taken out. Our herbivores or our primary consumers thrived. So this had a positive direct effect on the elk population. But then this had a very negative indirect effect on vegetation because deer were overgrazing this grass. And that indirect impact on vegetation then really sort of messed up the rest of this community. Niche partitioning. So this allows for similar species to share resources without competing. So we call it Gauss's law of competitive exclusion. So this is when two species competing for the same limited resources, they can't coexist. So one will always have a slight advantage and outcompete the other. So this type of relationship generally has a direct positive impact on each species. All right, so we're going to watch this little video.
I really did not like sandboxes as a kid. It's not that I have a problem with sand, or sand on the beach, or sand castles, just sand boxes. See, as a little kid, I'd play with something, then I'd kind of forget about it, and then rediscover it, and it'd be all new again. This is what happened with my sandbox. Except, when I rediscovered it, the sand had all these tiny holes in it. My dad was with me and exclaimed, "Why, look at that! Your sandbox is full of antlions." Perhaps my dad should not have assumed that I knew what antlions were. I eventually figured out what they were later on, and it makes sense now because my father really loves insects. Antlions are insects. In their adult form, they sort of look, in my personal opinion, like a less cool version of a dragonfly. They are not a dragonfly. But in their larva stage, they look, well, not like many things I can compare it to. They have these mandibles and they make these sand pit traps. And then they wait with their mandibles just showing above the surface. When an ant or other small insect walks over their sandpit, they drag it in. They pull the ant underground, biting it and injecting it with enzymes to digest it in order to consume the ant's juices. I also have learned by watching them that they toss sand at their ant victim too if they need help subduing it before they drag them under. Thankfully, antlions are small. In fact, doodlebug is evidently another name for these things. I'm not exactly sure how you go from antlion to doodlebug, but okay. It's all relative. They're bad news for an ant because the antlion is a predator of the ant. The ant is their prey. That's an ecological relationship right there. And that's what we're going to talk about, ecological relationships. Typically, if we were to graph the predator and prey populations in our example, when the population of ants in this confined area increase, it is likely that the antlions, which are the predators, also will increase over time because they have more food to eat. However, if the antlions increase too much, there won't be enough ants, which are the prey, to feed on. So the antlions will decrease. You can see that relationship in this predator and prey graph. In most ecosystems, predator and prey graphs go up and down frequently. It cycles. Also, just because this antlion is a predator doesn't mean that this is the only role it plays. An antlion can get eaten by a bird. Now the antlion has just become the bird's prey. Competition is also another relationship to consider. Antlions are consumers, which means they have to eat other things. They can't make their own food. They have to compete with other antlions for this food too. This food being their prey, the ants. This example shows competition for a limiting biotic factor. And they're not just competing with other antlions for this biotic factor, they may have to compete with completely different species in the area that are also predators of ants, too. For example, jumping spiders like ants. It's not just consumers that compete. Producers, like this plant, make their own food, but that does not mean they don't have to deal with competition. For example, this plant here is competing for this limiting abiotic factor, light. Symbiotic relationships are specific types of relationships where different species live together. Parasitism is an example of a symbiotic relationship where one organism benefits and the other is harmed. An example? Well, I love dogs. Petunia is the cat person. When my family took in our rescue dog, she was 4 months old at the time. We learned from the vet that she would need to be treated for fleas and hookworms. We were able to give her medicine to treat these parasites. A good thing because these parasites can hurt the dog by feeding on their blood. A parasite is an organism that gets its nutrients from another organism and causes harm to its host. They can live inside or on their host. Mutualism is an example of a symbiotic relationship where both organisms involved benefit. You really need to look up a video about acacia ants and acacia trees because this is a fascinating example. See, some species of acacia trees form these hollow thorns which provide housing to acacia ants. Some species even provide a nectar for food for these ants. So, what does this tree get in return? Protection. I'd hate to be a type of consumer that eats acacia trees because if it has acacia ants, the ants will come out of the thorns and attack the consumer. They'll even destroy plants that try to grow close to the acacia tree so the ants can eliminate the tree's competition. Nice mutual relationship between the acacia tree and the acacia ant. The last symbiotic relationship we'll mention is commensalism. This one is interesting because in this relationship, one organism benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. It has a neutral effect. Some species of barnacles and whales are a great example. Many barnacle species can attach themselves to moving things, like a boat or a whale. On a free whale ride, the barnacles get a lot of access to food since they are filter feeders, and the whale may travel to nutrient rich waters. In this particular example, the barnacles benefit, but neither help nor harm the whale, so this would be commensalism. But I do like to remind my students that sometimes there's more to the story with a relationship labeled as commensalism, and sometimes what we thought was a completely neutral effect may not always be in every case. So, why do all these relationships matter anyway? Well, one reason is that these interactions can make significant impacts on populations of different species living together. That means if the population of a certain species is threatened by human activity, for example, it can affect more than just that one species. Scientists continue to learn about new ecological relationships all the time. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
Okay, so that video does a really great job of looking at ecological relationships. So now that we kind of have those numerous examples, we're going to take a little closer look. So we talked about intra and interspecific. So ecological relationships, one of them is competition and predation. So with competition, so something like males fighting over mating rights, that's a very common example of intraspecific, so between two of the same species. But something such as cheetahs and leopards using the same watering hole, that's interspecific. They are different species, but they are competing for the same resource. Predation, this is often going to play a major role in determining the composition of a community. So, predators are obviously going to prefer efficiency. They don't want to waste a lot of energy and time. So, they're often going to live in the same area as their preferred prey. So, this can have an indirect effect on other species that may end up as prey, even if that wasn't the intention to begin with. Coevolution is another ecological relationship. So, this can occur due to these relationships when the evolution of traits within one species leads to the evolution of traits in another. So something like flowers and butterflies, it's led to really big diversification in both species. So like there's certain nectar producing flowers that have evolved long entryways, which only allows access to very specific hummingbirds, which act as their pollinators. So this is a flower and a hummingbird that have kind of co-evolved together. Another one is symbiosis. So we had heard about these specific ecological relationships in the video. These are any long-term close relationships between individuals of two different species, so not the same. So parasitism, this is when one of those species in the interaction is harmed by the presence or action of the other one. So fleas feeding off blood of a larger organism, that's parasitism. So if your dog has fleas or cat or animal, whatever, that is parasitism. The flea is benefiting while the dog, cat, animal is being harmed. Mutualism is where both members are benefiting from the interaction. So clownfish, when you saw, Finding Nemo, which you've probably seen, marlin lives in the anemone. So clownfish are adapted to living in anemone, which actually sting. So they give clownfish protection, and the fish actually help chase off other fish that might try to eat the anemone. So they help both of each other out. They give the fish somewhere to live and protection, while the fish also provides some protection. Commensalism is where one member benefits, but the other is neither harmed nor helped by the interaction. So a great example is like barnacles attaching to the surface of a whale. They're not taking anything from the whale, but it gives them a surface to attach to. And it's good for the barnacle, but the whale is not being harmed. Another ecological relationship is cooperation. So there is evidence of both intraspecific, so same species, and interspecific cooperation, shown an enhanced ability of each to access and utilize resources. So these can be long-term interactions like mutualism, or they can be short-term kind of opportunistic things. So like pack hunting allows hyenas to capture larger prey, and so each member is better able to access sufficient food. Right now, we're going to talk about Simpson's diversity. So this is an equation that you're going to have on your equation sheet. This is looking at the structure of a community. It can basically be described by its species composition and the amount of diversity that you have in the community. So in order to accurately assess changes in a particular ecosystem or compare two similar but separate ecosystems, it's important to kind of quantify the biodiversity. How much biodiversity do you have in these separate ecosystems? So this is what our equation looks like. It's a pretty easy one. So it's 1 minus the sum of n, which is the total number of organisms of a particular species, divided by all of the organisms, and then squared. So diversity is related to both species richness and relative abundance. So the number of different species in a community is considered its richness, while the relative abundance looks at the proportion of each species within the community. So a community dominated by one or two species, that is way less diverse than one that has an even distribution of numbers in its population. So if we are looking at this table here, even though the two samples have the same species richness, they have 3 species total, sample 2 is less diverse than sample 1. We can see that it has a much higher um, sample of buttercup flower species, whereas our sample 1 has a very even distribution between our 3 flower species. So as richness and evenness, or relative abundance increase, diversity is going to increase. So Simpson's diversity index takes into account both richness and the relative abundance. So by subtracting the sum of the values in the equation from 1, it's more intuitive to determine diversity. So the closer the value is to 1, the more diverse the community is. right? So if we were to take this, you could pause, calculate Simpson's diversity for this equation. So you would basically go one species at a time, plugging it into this equation, and we would be able to see what Simpson's diversity index would be for the entire population. So we would plug it in. Sorry, bell. So again, we would take these individually. That's our small n. We'd take the sum of all of those divided by the total number, which is adding all of these up. We would square it and subtract it from 1. The closer it is to 1, the more diversity we see. Right. So biodiversity. Biodiversity is basically how many different species occupy a specific niche within a system. I'm going to play this video for you.
Biodiversity is a term that represents the total variety of all life on Earth. That's a big thing to sum up. Thousands of different wild habitats, millions of different species, billions of different individuals, and the trillions of different characteristics they all have. The total biodiversity of our planet is immense, which is a good thing, because the more biodiversity, the more secure all life on Earth is, including ourselves. Only when life is at its most varied, vigorous, biodiverse, can we hope to thrive. We may not know it, but we need towering forests across 1/3 of the land surface to lock away carbon and keep the climate stable. We need millions of pollinators and billions of soil organisms and megatons of plankton to keep the food we eat in supply. We need strange plants deep in jungles to create our medicines, and coral reefs and mangrove swamps to protect the coasts we depend upon. Our planet's biodiversity provides all the things we need for free, but it will only do so if there's lots of it, and at the moment it's under attack. In the last 50 years, our activities have dramatically reduced biodiversity across the globe. We've snuffed out habitats, reduced populations of wild animals by 60%, and even driven whole species extinct. The number of lions in Africa has dropped by 65%. The number of individual flying insects in Europe has dropped by 75%. The number of bluefin tuna in the Pacific has dropped by 95%. Biodiversity is dropping everywhere and fast. This is catastrophic for nature and therefore ourselves. We talk about climate change a lot, but biodiversity loss is as important an issue. How do we stop this loss of life? How do we ensure that biodiversity, our planet's vital statistic, begins to increase again? In fact, we already know exactly what to do. Follow our planet. Visit our planet.
Okay. So biodiversity helps what is called ecological resilience. So genetic diversity and ecosystem diversity are important for ecological resilience. So we've talked about genetic diversity when we were in our genetics unit. Super important when it comes down to natural selection and the evolution of a species to have that diversity so that different individuals in a population have better chances of survival. So this allows populations to withstand massive environmental change. So we've already looked at kind of the peppered moths during the Industrial Revolution. So if they hadn't already had that genetic diversity in color, it would have wiped out that entire population. For overall ecosystem health, the more species diversity you have, the more likely the system can withstand disruptions. So, a good example is the desert environment. There's not a lot of species that live there, they do not have a lot of ecological diversity. So, if something was to happen to the desert, let's say it became something, somewhat of a cold type of weird environment, those species are very likely to get wiped out very easily, and that ecosystem is likely to collapse. Whereas if you look at something that has a lot of different species that live there, like the savanna, there's a bigger likelihood of those species, at least some of them, surviving if there was a massive disruption in that ecosystem. And then with maintaining diversity, so we know producers are fundamental to maintaining an ecosystem. So that's what's forming the basis of all trophic levels. So a food web would completely collapse if producers were taken out. This is another example of a trophic cascade. So cascades can happen from bottom up or from top down. All right, so a keystone species, I already kind of talked about this. This is a certain species that they basically have an outsized impact on ecological health. So they hold a more important role and have a bigger impact on an ecosystem than other species in that exact same ecosystem do. So it's not necessarily going to be the most abundant creature. So usually it's actually not in the largest numbers. It's not the biggest population, but they exert a very large control on ecosystem. I had a lot of you that were telling me you learned all about those otters forever and ever and ever in bio. They are a keystone species. If we take them out of the environment, which has happened in certain areas, sea urchins, which eat kelp, begin to overrun these ecosystems. And when you get rid of the kelp, you then get rid of every other species that can live there because you're getting rid of your producer. So when we put sea otters back into these systems, kelp urchins are kept in check because this is what otters eat, and kelp is able to grow again. So this is it for community ecology. Let me know if you have any questions, and you have your Ecology Part 3 packet that will be due on Monday. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions.